Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. We are here in Chapter 9 of, or at least this version of Chapter 9 of Hurley's Logic. Um, and we're looking at analogical and legal and moral reasoning. And these make up each section, as you can see, 9.1, 9.2, and 9.3. But really, they are all based on analogical reasoning, which is going to take up a major portion of what we're going to be working on, at least in this lecture. Again, this is Dr. Peter Grattan. We use analogical reasoning all the time. You see a movie, several movies by a certain director, say Quentin Tarantino, and you gather that his next movie, if it comes out, will be good because you've liked him in the past, or will be bad because you've liked him in the past. In other words, you're making an analogy from the past performance of that director to the present. You do that with the types of food you buy. You do that with every manner, in some sense, of every manner of every area of your life. And so what we're attempting to do, of course, in this course is not just do abstract reasoning for its own sake. I think that's important in philosophy. I think that's important in life, to be able to do abstract reasoning, but it's also extremely practical. In other words, there is something we're doing here that makes explicit something you're doing implicitly all the time. So, for example, Chapter 9, if, depending on when you're taking this course, but should generally follow around the time that you're actually taking this course and are deciding on what to take next semester if you're not, if things are not in the lucky spot where you might be graduating. If you are, congratulations. And with that in mind, by the way, I get emails all the time from people who are worried about their grades. Either they are used to getting A's and maybe Chapter 6 and parts of 7 were difficult to them. Perhaps you can breathe a sigh of relief because I think Chapter 9 will be, I'm not saying easy. I'm not suggesting any part of this book is easy. But what I will suggest is that that this work is important and I think probably easily more certainly if you don't want to see symbols, you are in the right place. Okay, and so analogical reasoning is important because we do it all the time. So the example used at the beginning of this chapter is about Stephen King's last novel, Campbell's Soup, and so on, and other detergents. And you take one thing or several things, and you decide whether you're going to make an analogy between that and something else. And we're going to see that we do that in moral reasoning, and we also do that, of course, in legal reasoning. That's called what's called in the law precedent. Okay, but the most important part to gather is in an analogy we have the relevance of the similarities in the analogy. So, for example, suppose a certain person is contemplating the purchase of a new car. She may decide in favor of a Chevrolet because she wants good fuel efficiency, and her friend Tom's new Chevy gets good fuel economy. So she might, however, use reasoning that doesn't help that analogy. For example, that has padded steering wheel, a tachometer, and so on, that have nothing to do with that. And so as we remember from Chapter 1, Chapter 1 described it inductive versus deductive reasoning. And in inductive reasoning, remember, we want a strong and then sound argument. That is, we want the probability to be good that if the premises are true, the conclusion must be true. And we also want it to be sound. That is, are the premises actually true? And have we left anything important out? Right? And so things need to be relevant. Okay, in the two analogies. So if we're comparing two cars about their fuel efficiency, it doesn't matter whether they're the same color. It doesn't matter whether they're have the same type tires, perhaps. But it does matter whether they have the same type engine and so on. Right? The number of similarities. The more similarities there are, the better. The more relevant similarities, though, the better. We'll get into this when we get into back into the slides. But I want to go over this quickly. And then we want to look at the nature and the degree of any disanalogies. Disanalogy just means any big differences, right? If you're comparing different types of cars, some things might be very different. For example, it could be the fact that Tom drives on relatively clear freeways, and Lucy's argument would be weakened, right? Because this is a different way than she drives, because she drives on congested freeways. And so often cars, as you know, some get better gas mileage on congested freeways and do much, much better on highways, and vice versa. I should say, students have asked me what this is in the past. Jackrabbit starts is basically when you're at a red light or at a stop sign and you just gun it. You just put the pedal to the metal, or literally just floor it. Put the gas pedal to the floor. That's an old name for jackrabbit start. I'm hoping there's nothing offensive in the background of that name. We have lots of things have stuck in the language that you find out later have based on terms you probably wouldn't want to use. But jackrabbit sounds pretty benign. In any event, that's another argument from analogy. That is, a certain set of words one learns later on are actually offensive. And you want to be careful about using terms you don't know from the past, because there might be something offensive behind it. So for example, something I learned growing up is that we used all the time was cotton picking. Like it's a, cotton picking minute. And I came from New York, where this had nothing to do with being near places with cotton or anything. It was just in the language of the cartoons I was watching. And so I might repeat that. Well, it turns out it tends to be offensive. So I'm using an argument from analogy there. It's relatively weak. Why? Because jackrabbit doesn't sound like it'd be anything offensive. Whereas if you think for a minute, it doesn't take you long to realize who might have been picking cotton in the past, why one would consider cotton, the notion between the relationship between time and cotton picking, and then of course the punishments to those who didn't live up to that cotton picking minute. It's a hard phrase to say. In any event, the number of primary analogs. So the primary analogs are what you're comparing from. That's Tom's car. Now, it could be Tom's car, and she could also be talking about other people with Chevys, and those would be other primary analogs. The secondary analog is her new car. She wants to buy a new Chevrolet. Another thing to look at is the diversity among the primary analogs. So we suppose that, for example, 4 of Lucy's friends all buy their gas at the same station and so on. Well, this will weaken her argument. What we want is actually more diversity. So in the sciences, we actually tend to think that we want repeatability, that if some things have been done the same way and they repeat again and again, that might strengthen our analogy. But the problem is that if Lucy doesn't do these things that all of her friends are doing, and I assume you've read this chapter already before you've turned this on, so I assume you know the examples they're using. So that's why I'm not reading them out. But if they have gone to different mechanics and different stations and so on, well, that's helpful for her, because they're getting good gas mileage even if they're going to different gas stations, they're getting different types of gas, their tires are inflated to different pressures and so on, and yet they're still getting good gas mileage. Well, that strengthens her argument that she should get a new Chevy. I feel like this is a long advertisement now for Chevy, but that's the example used. Interestingly enough, too, the stronger the conclusion, the weaker the argument. In other words, if you're not making a specific conclusion, if I say, my new car may get as good a gas mileage as, Tom's car, right? That's not very specific. May get. I'm not being very specific. Well, that's a good argument from analogy. But if I say it's going to get exactly the same amount of gas mileage as his car, I'm getting very specific, and that's hard to match. Okay, so analogy is about probability. And so when I add probability into it, when I make it more general and instead of specific, I get a better argument. Okay? So the more relevant the similarities between primary and secondary analogs, the stronger the argument. The greater the number of similarities between primary and secondary analogs, that is a number of similarities between Tom's car and her car, the stronger the argument. The greater the differences between the primary and secondary analogs are disanalogies, which can either strengthen or weaken the argument, right? So we can have Luke is driving in such a Tom. I keep thinking Luke. Tom could be driving in such a way that actually he would be getting worse gas mileage than Lucy ever would get. And so that difference actually strengthens their argument. Well, she's a very laid back driver. She doesn't do jackrabbit starts, as we're now learning the term. She's not doesn't drive like Tom, but Tom does. He races all over the place, and that tends to decrease gas mileage. So that difference actually strengthens her argument. If Tom can get that kind of gas mileage and he drives like that, imagine what kind of gas mileage she can get. Then also there's the greater the number of similar primary analogs, the stronger the argument. The similar primary analogs are counter analogies, and these weaken the argument. The more diverse the primary analogs, the stronger the argument. And then the more specific the conclusion, the weaker the argument. Okay, so this will bring us into the questions later on. Just to shoot forward, this legal reasoning we'll get into in a little bit. But basically what happens is in judicial cases, judges are looking to make an analogy between the case before them and previous cases. And so the stronger the analogy to a previous case, the more likely they are to see that as relevant, right, to the case before them. And they are likely to rule in a similar manner as the case previous. That is known as precedent. And precedent is extremely important in the law. It is not always followed for various reasons. This is not to get into legal very difficult forms of legal reasoning, but there are different legal and judicial philosophies. Some rely much more on precedent than others, but in general, the law could not function without the idea of precedent, right? You'd have anarchy. Each new case would have to be decided all on its own without any previous arguments, without any analogies to previous cases. That has never been done in American and Canadian law, and it will not be done in the foreseeable future. Okay, and so you can see that they bring up cases where we look at the similarities and differences between those cases. In moral reasoning, arguments for analogy and use are decided, of course, moral and questions. Such arguments often happen in the context of a dialogue. So they give here a rather long dialogue, but what you'll find on the test is, on the quiz, is what is appropriate analogy? Can you make that analogy strong? In other words, for example, people who talk about the morality of fetal abuse are obviously making an analogy between the fetus and a child. And just as we would not accept the abuse of a child, we would not accept we should not accept the abuse of a fetus. And so this section is basically all about analogies and then counter analogies, and then we get the exercises, okay? But let's go through here. You already have these exercises, and for most of them you have the same questions, and you're asked here whether these strengthen or weaken a main argument. I think these are straightforward in general. And you'll be able to see, I think, fairly quickly what strengthens and weakens. But what I like about this chapter is that we use analogies all the time, whether you're deciding to go see a movie, whether you're deciding a moral question, whether you're deciding whether something's fair, whether you're deciding even to go to a certain place for lunch today. Well, the last time I went there, the pizza wasn't very good. So by analogy, right, the pizza's probably not going to be that good this time. But you might find some reasons to say, hey, maybe the pizza is better this time. They have a new manager, they have a new chef, and so on, okay? We often use that kind of analogical reasoning, okay, for not only legal and moral reasoning, but also just for everyday getting around, okay? Good, so let's go into this, right? Make sure the volume is not down. Good, we will go into analogy. Right, it's good to see we're still recording up there. As I said before, we'll do full screen. So before it's always a bit, worrisome because I can never sort of stop this. So this is going to review a little bit of what I've said, but I wanted to show the chapter first. So chapter 9 further explores the argument from analogy, which we saw in chapter 1, and how it applies in the context of law and morality. Okay, morals are a bit different. I should be clear here. I would differentiate this. Morals tend to be the mores we have in society. That is, what are the general ethical codes that we're expected to follow, say, in a country that is mostly Christian, or a country that is very individualistic or something. And then ethics tends to get into deciding particular cases, either based upon those morals or those we come up upon our own. Okay. So from chapter 1, we remember that analogy is a kind of inductive argument that concludes that something is true of one thing because of the similarity to something else. And we're going to see that we're actually going to see many things that could be true. Okay, so we already know this, right? And so we don't need to go through that example. Okay, the structure is this. A, B, and C are to X, right, the primary analog, as A, B, and C are to a secondary analog. Again, we get the name Tom, confusingly enough, who was the primary analog in the book, but let's leave it go. The X represents the feature of liking the movie, because this is the example. Well, I like the movie. Well, the previous movie had these 3 things about it. The new movie has this many things about it. So since it's present, it's probably also present for Tom, right? Okay, good. So let's now change the situation. I don't know why there's a mushroom here. Kim and Eve have mushrooms growing in their garden. Kim's mushrooms are psychedelic and she enjoys them from time to time. So one day Kim brings one of her mushrooms over to her friend Eve, and after looking at it, Eve notices a strange similarity between this mushroom and a certain mushroom she found growing in her own garden. Eve concludes that her mushroom is psychedelic too, and she's anxious to try it. Okay, don't know why that's there, but in any event, that's something to think about, right? That we are concluding that her mushroom is psychedelic. By the way, just as a little aside, you shouldn't be trying just any old mushroom from any place. Make sure you get it checked out with a professional. Many mushrooms, of course, as you know, the majority of them can be poisonous. Okay, so the primary analog is Kim's mushroom, right, which was psychedelic, and Eve's mushroom. The letters A, B, and C represent features that are known to be shared by the 2 mushrooms, and X represents the feature of being psychedelic. So these 3 features are seen, therefore it's psychedelic. These 3 features are seen. Is it psychedelic? All right, does that mean that the analogy holds? Again, this is a very boring way in some sense of describing analogies, but we'll get past that soon to examples where we see how important it is, right? But it has these features, and it turns out to be psychedelic. We find out it has these features. Is it psychedelic? Now, the question is whether these are relevant similarities. Are they relevant to it being psychedelic? Right? So, for example, it's a specific color. B could be a specific shape or texture. And C could be a kind of smell it has. Will Eve get what she expects when she eats her mushroom? Well, it's the same color, it has a specific shape, and a certain fragrance. That seems to me probable, right? That is, if it seemed to be growing in Kim's backyard, and it's found growing in her backyard, that's a D thing that's not mentioned, right? That it's not something growing in a wild forest far from home, but we assume that they live in the same general area, then perhaps it's probable. Yeah, color, shape, texture, and so on are all relevant to the essential nature of a mushroom, right? If you're looking to see what kind of a mushroom is, which is probably not a conversation you have that often, you look to its shape, you look to its color, you look to its smell, you look to its potential size, and so on, okay? Now, suppose it was picked on Tuesday morning, it was fertilized by Miracle-Gro, and grown in a small garden. These 3 things. Well, will she get what she expects when she eats the mushroom, that it's psychedelic? I can't believe they're using that as an example. Probably not. These 3 features are not relevant to whether something is psychedelic or not, right? Just forgetting that all the other things we've mentioned. Let's say that A, B, and C are this. It's picked on not its shape or anything, but it's picked on a Tuesday morning, fertilized by Miracle-Gro, grown in a small garden, small garden. Well, that happens to be, frankly, all mushrooms that people grow personally. They use a fertilizer. They pick them on certain days of the week. They're grown in a small garden. That has nothing to do with whether they are psychedelic or not. Okay? So they're all irrelevant, right? So that's number 1 in the book. What are the relevance of these similarities? So your answers to these 2 questions indicate the first principle to be used in evaluating an argument from an analogy. the relevance of their similarities. Color, shape, and texture, of course, are relevant, but not fertilizer, not the size of the garden. They're not relevant because no matter what fertilizer you use, I guess, unless you are poisoning it or in some way, you shouldn't get a psychedelic effect out of the mushroom. So now let's return to Eve, recognizing that discretion is the greater part of valor. Eve decides to examine her mushroom more closely before eating it, right? So she comes up with more attributes, D, E, and F, which her mushroom shares with the one Kim has brought over. The situation now looks like this. So now there are 6 similarities and X remains. She has these 6 similarities and so it's psychedelic. Mine, Eve is saying, has these 6 attributes, so mine must be psychedelic. Or is it? That's the question, right? So assuming that all 6 attributes are relevant, how does the addition of the 3 new attributes bear on Eve's argument that her mushroom is psychedelic? Well, the more similarities we have, if they're relevant, as we've seen already in the book, strengthens it. Okay? The additional attributes provide further grounds for 2 mushrooms being similar. Okay? So good. This brings us to principle 2, the number of similarities. The more similar 2 things are, the better the analogy between them. Assuming that the similarities between primary analog, that is the thing that you're looking at to make an analogy to what you have, right? So just Lucy's Chevy, this is a secondary analogy, or the mushroom that is being found in Eve's backyard. The more that similarities are found between them, the greater the number of similarities, the stronger the argument. So Eve recalls having read now a newspaper article about someone who died from eating poisonous mushrooms. So she decides to take one more look at Kim's mushroom. Eve finds 3 attributes, G, I, and H, which Kim's mushroom has, but her mushroom does not have. In place of those 3 attributes, Eve's mushroom has attributes M, N, and O, and obviously they're not being specific here, right? So we have these 3 primary analogs, these different attributes, these 6 attributes. Now, does having now 3 attributes that are different make the analogy between the primary analog, that is the first mushroom, and the secondary analog, that is Eve's mushrooms that she's looking at whether to eat right now, does that make better? There's, I think, an assumption she wants to avoid psychedelic mushrooms, but I'm unsure. But either way, so she doesn't want to be eating this. She's going to be careful, right? How does it bear on Eve's argument that her mushroom is psychedelic now? So let's say that G, H, and I tend to enhance a psychedelic effect. Well, M, N, and O do not. How does this bear on Eve's argument that her mushroom is psychedelic? Well, these tend to increase it, right? These don't, and she doesn't have it. So I would say that it weakens the effect, right? It's possible that most or all of the psychedelic power comes out of these 3 new attributes she finds, and therefore these are disanalogies, right? Right? That is, they are disanalogs. These make them different, and they're important. Okay? So on the other hand, M and O tend to enhance the psychedelic effect while G, H, and I do not. How does it bear on Eve's argument? I think this is repeating it. Again, it weakens it, right? Sorry, did I do something there? Let's go back. Okay, M and O now make Eve's... Got it. So I must have misread something. Let's go back. Assuming that G, H, and I tend to enhance the psychedelic effect, while M and O do not, how does this bear on Eve's argument that her mushroom here is psychedelic? As we said, it weakens it because it could be these 3 things that make it psychedelic, and therefore these parts have no relevance. Good. Now let's see what I misread. On the other hand, if M and O tend to enhance a psychedelic effect while G and H and I do not, how does this bear on Eve's argument? Oh, then it strengthens it, right? If we find out these tend to add to psychedelic qualities, and you'll excuse your professor's lack of knowledge of what any of those attributes would be, but I tend to think you would think of that as a good thing for your professor to have. There's kinds of ignorance that are probably good for me to have. If we find out this is psychedelic, these are psychedelic qualities, it strengthens her argument that what is in front of her is indeed psychedelic. Okay? It might even have more psychedelic powers than Kim's. So the attributes G, H, I, M, and N, O are called disanalogies. Some strengthen them, some don't. Your answer to the last two questions indicate the third principle to be used in evaluating arguments from analogy, the nature and the degree of disanalogy. And so as we just saw, depending on the nature and degree, disanalogies can either strengthen or weaken an argument, right? So in the first place, they weakened it, and in the second case, it strengthened it. However, Eve is still not convinced. She's really on the case of a psychedelic mushroom. After all, it's possible the real psychedelic mushrooms look different from one single mushroom Kim brought over. Perhaps this mushroom is just a freak of nature, right? In other words, this one ended up being psychedelic, but perhaps that was just a weird one out in her garden. When Kim brings over the two new mushrooms, Eve examines them both, and she finds that both share with her own mushrooms the same 6 relevant attributes that the first one did. So now we're getting more primary analogs. You'll see this on the next page. More, right? That is, she finds 3, they end up being psychedelic. I have these 6 attributes. That's more likely to have that, right? So the more primary analogs that have these attributes, the more likely a secondary analog is going to have that attribute. Sorry to speak in such in the sometimes obtuse language of the chapter, but just basically the more examples you have that are similar to your own, and the more of those attributes that it has are similar, the more likely it is B. So I don't know if this is a loaded one, but just one off the top of my head. Imagine you're talking about a family, right, of 4 brothers. This is and your parents know that you're dating this one. This brother, whether you have to be a boy or a girl, let's not be assume anything like that, right? And they say, okay, so this is let's see, Peter, John, Adam, and this boy is Eric, the last kid. And these 3 have the same 6 attributes. They grew up in the same home, same exact parents, same amount of lack of attention to education, same bad grades in school, same trouble in school, and so on, right? So, having problems with the law. All 3 of them have this, right? Then you find out that Eric, just like Adam, Peter, and John, have these same attributes. Your parents are going to do what, by analogy? They're going to say, do not go out with Eric, okay? Or if you're interested in females, you could say Erica, 4th sister. Well, that might be a disanalogy that she's a female, but in this case, a lot of the attributes are the same, right? Gender was not the attribute that we said was being shared. Okay? So primary analogs, we could be here Kim, Bob's, and Jim's mushrooms. Secondary analog could be Eve's mushrooms. So how the introduction of additional primary analogs bear on Eve's argument that her mushroom is psychedelic? Well, the more examples that are similar, that have those similarities, and have that factor of being psychedelic, the more it's likely to be this. And so in the analogy I was using about a family of John, Peter, and Adam, and then having someone named, another brother named Eric, this would be their moral standing, their character, what kind of character they have, right? Will your parents or friends like the fact that you were going out with them? When they know these 3, well, they like the 4th, right? I tend not to like arguments from the family because biology is not as strong often as we think, but still, that's often an analogy we use. Well, of course, this is going to strengthen the analogy, right? The introduction of 2 more primary analogs, which is another way of saying 2 similar examples, helps the case. Okay, it strengthens it, right? So your answer indicates the 4th principle to be used in evaluating arguments from analogy. We've seen this in the book. Quickly, but we're going here more slowly. The number of primary analogs. As the number of primary analogs increases, the strength of the argument increases. So desiring still further evidence, Eve phones 2 of her friends, Bob and Jim, who live in nearby towns. She asks them if they happen to have any psychedelic mushrooms growing in their gardens. Amazingly, and this suggests what kind of friends Eve has, whether you consider that good or bad, and depending on the laws of of your town, state, city, or whatever. When Bob and Jim each bring Eve one of their mushrooms, Eve compares them with Kim's and she finds that they are virtually identical. Now we're getting more of these analogs, right? And so these similarities are going to help. It's also about diversity. These are from 3 different places. And so we imagine the soil might be slightly different at this garden, from this garden, and yet they all produced that psychedelic effect. Okay, so this strengthens her argument, right? Again, it strengthens it because they're from different places in town, not just from the same garden, but from different places in town. One could imagine that something in the soil at Kim's place might be the reason for the psychedelic effect, right? Just imagine you know nothing about mushrooms other than their shape, generally. Then the fact that they're grown in different places and have these 6 similarities and produce that is going to make it more likely. So he strengthens that argument, right? So these 2 new analogs add more support, right? So it's not that Kim's garden is peculiar, but in fact, actually, there's something similar going on, okay? So your answer to this question gives us the 5th principle, diversity among the primary analogs. Again, diversity is good here, okay? In general, you might think reflexively that what you want is similarity. But in fact, actually, the fact that they are similar, but under the diverse circumstances, actually helps and strengthens your inductive argument. So the more diverse the primary analogs are, the stronger the argument. That's our new principle. So suppose Eve now changes her conclusion to state that if she eats her mushroom, she will experience exactly the same effect as if she were to eat Kim's mushroom. Note how specific this conclusion is. The exact same experience. Now, as we know from popular culture, and perhaps you know from friends and so on, under the state of drugs, people experience vastly different things, whether those medications are legal or illegal. That's what can make it difficult to diagnose and give medications for everything from the common cold to depression and so on. So I'll keep my examples to legal drugs, right? But suppose that, now changes her conclusion to state that if she eats her mushrooms, she will experience exactly. That's a very specific one. And so the more specific our conclusion, the more it weakens it. Okay? So it's harder to prove. Okay? But suppose we change the conclusion to state that if she eats her mushroom, she'll experience approximately the same effect. Well, she weakens it, therefore she actually weakens the conclusion, oddly enough, strengthens the argument. Okay? Weaken the conclusion, strengthen the argument. Okay? So your answer to the last 2 questions indicates the 6th and final principle to use in evaluating arguments from analogy. The specificity of the conclusion. The more specific it is, the weaker the argument. The less or specific or more general the conclusion, or the more vague, the more helpful. That is, the stronger the argument. Okay, so let's move forward. So Sam is anticipating the purchase of a cell phone. Sam's friend Sue has a Nokia, and she gets excited. This is a bit of an older example. I don't know if even Nokias are around. They used to be the dominant cell phone company from about 2000 to, I don't know, I owned a Nokia myself. And she gets excellent reception with her phone. Sam concludes that if he gets a Nokia, I'm sorry, I gendered the Sam there, but we need to be careful these days when we read these examples. Concludes that if he gets a Nokia, his reception should be just as good as Sue's. So suppose that Sam's phone is the same model as Sue. How does this fact bear on Sam's argument? Well, it should strengthen it, right? Right? That this exact same phone model? Yeah. If it was different phone models, then that might have a very different effect on the reception. Okay? The model of the phone is relevant, I would say. Now, Sam is anticipating the purchase of a cell phone, blah, blah, blah. Suppose that Sam's phone has a leather case, just like Sue's. Does it strengthen it? No, a leather case shouldn't have any effect on the reception of a cell phone. It doesn't weaken it. It doesn't weaken the argument. I just think it has no effect. Whether a cell phone has a leather case is irrelevant to the quality of reception, right? Otherwise, nobody would put a case on their cell phones, such as the iPhone or Androids, right? So a new fact is given us, and this is the kind of questions you get in the homework assignments. Suppose that Sam lives 2 miles from a transmitting tower while Sue lives only half a mile from one. How does this fact bear on Sam's argument? Well, let's see. Sue has a Nokia. She lives only half a mile, and she gets great reception. Well, this actually weakens the argument because, of course, only half a mile from the cell tower, Sue should be getting excellent reception, even with a particularly bad phone. So this weakens the argument. Okay, Sam is farther away. Since Sam is farther away from the transmitting tower, it's more likely that his reception will not be as good. For some of you, this is a history lesson because, in fact, in many places, of course, there are so many towers within given cities, such as New Orleans and so on, that how far you are should not have that much of an impact on your reception. Although, of course, reception is still important as we drive through the countryside and so on. You could see it go up and go down, and even reach places within the state and elsewhere, of course, where reception disappears. So again, it's the same thing. Sam concludes, by analogy, that if he gets a Nokia, his reception will be good as Sue. Now suppose that Sam lives in a steel reinforced building while Sue lives in a wood frame house. Okay? This is again going to weaken Sam's argument. I'm presuming that a steel reinforced house would make it more difficult to get good reception, and so we're going to weaken the argument. Okay? In other words, Sue is living in a wood frame house, so that doesn't generally have too much of an effect on cell phone reception, especially when we're up to LG, LTE, and so on, right? So it should weaken it, right? The steel building could impair the reception of our signal, right? We know that. Anybody who stepped into a certain building or goes underground or goes to certain parts of the campus knows that you can actually lose reception depending on where you are. Okay? And so these are, again, the types of questions that you get in the homework. Another thing, suppose that Sam's phone has a cigarette light adapter just like Sue's. Does this fact bear? Now, this is another similarity. I don't know why a phone would have a cigarette light adapter, but would this fact bear on Sam's argument? I think it has no effect. I assume the cigarette light adapter would be an adapter for one's car. That has more to do with being able to keep it charged, but no, it should have no effect. The cigarette light adapter is irrelevant to the quality of reception. Okay, so let's do another practice problem. Sam is anticipating the purchase of a cell phone. Sam's friend Sue has a Nokia, and she gets excellent reception with her phone. Sam concludes that he gets a Nokia. His reception will be as good as Sue's. Sorry. So this is exactly the same. Suppose that Sam has 4 other friends who have Nokia phones, and all 4 of them get excellent reception. Well, that's good. We have more primary analogs. This would strengthen our argument. You see, if we have 4 more people who get good reception, that's good. That strengthens it. Okay, so that's principle number 1. The number of primary, or I think principle number 1, the number of similar primary analogs. Now suppose that these 4 friends live in different parts of town. Well, that's another one of our principles of diversity. That strengthens our argument too. They all lived in the same part of town. For example, they lived across from Sue, who lives only half a mile away from the cell tower. That would weaken it. That strengthens it, though. We have a diversity among the primary analogs. So suppose that these 4 friends live in wood frame houses. Okay. I suppose that we're supposed to believe, too, that we're supposed to keep in mind the previous argument, namely that, the previous premise, which was that Sam is living in a steel house. I'm not sure why he's living there, but in a steel house. We'll just leave that unexplained. Perhaps he was found using his cell phone to pick up psychedelic drugs, as in the previous example. I don't know. And he's locked up somewhere. But either way, the fact that these 4 friends live in wood frame houses would seem to weaken it. I'm only concluding that it should have no effect, but I'm assuming they still think that Sam is living in the steel house. So let's say it weakens it. We reduce the diversity among the primary analogs, and this fact constitutes a disanalogy with respect to Sam's residence. In other words, Sam's residence is still the iron place. These friends live in wood houses just like Sue. That's a disanalogy, which is another way of saying the attributes are different, right? And therefore, it doesn't strengthen it, it weakens it. But we do this all the time, again, right? Like you say you get good cell phone reception, or you have, each of us, and of course, many students, have difficulty affording this, but it seems more and more that almost all students try to find a way to have cell phones, even before they even have a car, that it's that important. And of course, it's less expensive than a car. And that it's become something is de rigueur. And I'm not saying it's inexpensive or that some students don't have these or that it's affordable for everyone, but I would presume it's become that kind of thing. And we go around and why do we buy certain cell phones? Well, we have friends who say, look, I have an iPhone. I find it very easy to use with my sharing information across with my iPad and so on. I find it very easy to save my photos. It takes these kinds of photos and so on. Or you have friends who argue for the Androids, right? In the same way that a generation ago, people were arguing over the difference between Windows, that is Microsoft-based machines, and now we argue and former Apple machines, that is iMacs and so on. And now we also talk about Androids, right? So people talk about what are the analogies and disanalogies. Well, the disanalogies might lead one to go towards one thing or another. That is the differences, right? There's very few things you can do with an iPhone unless you do what is not supposed to be done, which is that is you crack the iPhone and so on. What's called a crack. That is you get into its operating system so it can be changed. But in general, you look for the disanalogies and you look for the analogies among them to decide upon what kind of things you will do, what kind of phone you will buy. So he's anticipating still this iPhone. His reception will be as good. Suppose that Sam changes his conclusion to say he will get reception approximately as good as Sue's. That is, if memory serves, I think he said he would get the same reception. So this is approximately. He's weakening the conclusion, so he's strengthening the argument, right? It's not as specific, right? It's approximately as good as Sue's, not the same as Sue's. See how it's different? So now we move on to I think what is crucial here, especially for any essays you might have to answer, and the analogical reasoning in the law. Right? It's important because the rule of precedent requires that current cases be decided in the same way as similar cases in the past. The earlier cases are the primary analogs, and the case to be decided right now is the secondary analog. So suppose that walking on a public sidewalk, Mia encounters Roger, who is walking his dog, Rover. Rover bites Mia, and Mia sues Roger for damages. In researching Mia's case, you find 3 controlling cases. These are cases that are offer precedent in that area in your jurisdiction. A case called Carr versus, the V period is versus Wilson, Brady versus Tanner, these are all civil cases, and Foster versus Harris. So in legal cases, you might have like the state of Louisiana versus Wilson. That would definitely be more of a criminal case, sound like a criminal case. Although you could sue the state in civilly as well. But in any event, these kind of cases are when it's 2 names like that. These are civil cases, right? So in Carr versus William, Wilson's dog Fido bit Carr. The court ruled in favor of Carr. Fido had a history of biting people, but Rover has no such history. See how there's a disanalogy there? That is to say, a difference. How does this fact bear on Mia's case? So we found something that's a big difference here. So what could happen is Fido had a history of biting people, and the reason why you might find the defendant sorry, the person who's the person being sued more responsible, that is liable in the case, is because they were letting their dog go around biting people previously and were taking no responsibility. But the person who owns Rover, right, who is Roger, which is very helpful, just one letter off, has no such history, right? This would weaken that as a precedent, right? The fact that Fido had a history of biting people imposes a higher duty on care on Wilson, but no such higher duty was incumbent upon Roger. Roger wasn't aware this was a problem. Okay. Now there could be a law allowing one that if one's dog bites one at all, then one is civilly. It depends on the law of one's city, county, state, etc. Okay, but this would weaken the relevance of that case to this one. Suppose that while walking on a public sidewalk, Mia encounters Roger, who is walking his dog Rover. Rover bites Mia, and Mia sues Roger for damages. Okay. Suppose that Carr was walking on a public sidewalk when he was bitten. How does this fact bear on Mia's case? Well, let's see. They were walking dog Rover. She was on a public sidewalk. Carr, in that case, right? We're using the same case. I'm forgetting all the names, but I think it's Carr versus Wilson. Oh yeah, it's right up there in the top left, right? Well, this is a similarity, and the more similarities we find, as we learn from analogies, we strengthen the argument, and it's a relevant one, right? It's not that Mia was roaming onto Roger's private, land, or on, even into his house. Well, then we would expect Mia to be responsible for the fact that she's bitten. In fact, that's the reason why a lot of people get guard dogs. No, this was a public space. This would strengthen Mia's case against Roger for recovering damages. Now, suppose that Fido was wearing a collar, just like Rover. How does this fact bear on Mia's case? Now, this is something relevant. Now, I'm guessing that this is a tough one for me. On the one hand, it certainly doesn't weaken the case. It could strengthen it. It does suggest a certain care that both have over the animal. That is, that Fido was wearing a collar and Rover was wearing a collar. And people who put collars on their dogs tend to have more care of them. Some don't, and let them roam, and so on. So that is that's a similarity. The question is that similarity relevant? And I tend to think it should be. I tend to think that does strengthen it. But they're going to say no. Why is this fact relevant to the issue of liability? Well, I think that it's relevant just because typically this is where you keep the name of the dog with the address and so on, and this is the case as well. So the fact that they have a collar actually shows that they're treated in a similar way. But they're going with has no effect. That Rover was wearing a collar appears to be irrelevant. The appears to be, I think, is important there. So I admitted before I hit the answer that I thought they were going to go with have no effect. But I think there might be some relevance there. But it depends. Just knowing, as working from a pet shop when I was younger, the fact that a dog might be wearing a collar or not really did have an effect on what was done to the dog if, say, the local animal control agency was called for that dog. Okay? So suppose all of this has happened, okay? We have Rover biting Mia. Suppose that Rover was on a leash, but Fido wasn't, right? How does this fact bear on Sam's argument, right? I don't know how this bears on Sam's argument because we seem to be having Roger and Mia, okay? So we don't have Sam's argument. What we have is how does this bear on the argument that that Mia's argument for suing Roger for damages, right? So Rover was on a leash. Fido, in this case, was not. Well, it seems that it weakens it because here Roger seems to be taking much more responsibility over Rover than this person, Wilson, who owned the dog Fido in that case. So since he's being more responsible, right, by putting Rover on a leash, right, he seems to be trying to take care that Rover does not bite other people. So I think this would weaken the argument, right? The fact that Fido was not on a leash increases Wilson's level of negligence. That in the law, in case you don't know it, is often used in lawsuits. That is, were you negligent? For example, if you left out a slippery sidewalk in front of your business, or you knew that the sliding doors at your place of business were constantly shutting suddenly and hitting people. Well, then you're being negligent, right? And it could be the main reason why he lost the case. Mia cannot use this argument against Roger. Roger was not being negligent with Rover. Roger had Rover on a leash, okay? And it's a very relevant fact for whether you're arguing negligence. So we get a second case. Brady versus Tanner. Tanner's dog Bonzo, I wish he bit Brady. Tanner won. Okay, so we have a similar case. Somebody's bit. And Brady, who sues Tanner, wins, just as Mia is suing Roger. So we know the case already. In Brady versus Tanner, Tanner's dog Bonzo bit Brady. The court ruled in favor of Tanner. Brady was bitten while walking the public sidewalk. How does this fact bear on Mia's case? Well, again, it strengthens it. Oh, this is a similarity, though. The court ruled in favor, let's see. In Brady versus Tanner, Tanner's dog Bonzo bit Brady. The court ruled in favor of Tanner. Oh, the defendant. Sorry, the defendant. Brady was bitten while walking on a public sidewalk. This would weaken it. Thank you. It would weaken it. My fault. Tanner is the defendant here. So the fact that they are similar cases and Tanner won, that is the person with the biting dog won, means that this is not going to help Mia in her case. This is going to weaken it. And so in fact, I can imagine her going to court and saying, no, go look at the first case, not this one. Okay? So this weakens her case because the defendant won in the previous one. The fact increases the similarity between Brady versus Tanner and Mia's case, and Brady lost that case. That is, the person who was bit. Okay? This is another good time to say, read the examples and questions closely, especially on the quizzes and so on, so that you don't get caught up like that, but that's fine. It's good to talk through the example. Suppose that while walking on a public sidewalk, Mia encounters Roger, who is walking his dog Rover, etc. Brady, we find, remember, was a former neighbor of Tanner's who had abused Bonzo in the past. Okay? So Tanner had seen, I guess Brady had seen Tanner abuse Bonzo in the past. Your client, Mia, never abused Rover, right? This is very relevant here, right? In other words, Brady, this is the grammar here, right? The who, just no right. I'm presuming the grammar is off here. What they're saying is Brady was a former neighbor of Tanner's and would go over and abuse Bonzo, but the grammar here does not lend itself to that. But in any event, Brady abused Bonzo. Well, that would lead Bonzo to be more likely to bite Brady. But Mia never abused Rover. This would strengthen her case. Okay? That is, this is a disanalogy or difference between their cases in which Mia has not done anything like that to the animal. Right? So we cannot, this strengthens her argument. Right? This is a disanalogy and it distinguishes Brady versus Tanner from Mia's case. Remember, she wants to distinguish from this. She wants her case to look different from that case. Why? Because in that case, the defendant won, and she wants it to look like a case where the plaintiff, like her, won. Okay? So suppose that while walking on a public Bonzo regularly ate Purina dog chow. Rover ate another brand of dog food. How does the fact bear on Mia's case? I think it has no effect. Okay? Whatever kind of food that Bonzo or Rover ate, as long as it was dog food, as long as let's keep it within the realm of the real, that it's not some horror movie where one of the dogs is being fed something that leads them to like human meat or something like that. As long as there's each a brand of dog food, it has no effect, right? As far as we know, right? Like that different types of dog food, as far as we know, do not have that kind of effect. When Brady approaches Bonzo on the sidewalk, Bonzo began snarling, right? In spite of this, Brady continued walking forward. Rover did not snarl before biting Mia. Well, this would strengthen Mia's argument, right? This is a little more difficult than anything you'll get in the homework, right? But notice that Brady, who is the plaintiff, right, approached Bonzo. Bonzo begins snarling, and yet Brady keeps going towards Bonzo, right? Well, that's probably one of the reasons that Tanner won. Tanners could say, why did you keep coming towards the dog? You were the one who, in fact, were being negligent. You heard the snarling. But Rover did not snarl before biting Mia. She had no idea, in some sense, that this was coming. By the way, the example, there's something going off here. We're going with the same legal example. It's not about Nokia reception. This should strengthen the argument. Right? By continuing forward, Brady may have assumed the risk of being bitten, which may be the reason why he lost the case, but this is not a reason why Mia should lose. Now we have the third final legal case. Harris's dog Rex bit Foster. Foster won. So now we have a case where the plaintiff won. Okay? So we have these same cases. Mia is the plaintiff, right? The dog who bites her is Rover. Rex is the dog involved here. So in Foster versus Harris, Harris's dog Rex bit Foster, right? The court ruled in favor of the plaintiff, Foster. Rex is a German Shepherd, but Rover is a pit bull. How might this fact bear on Mia's case? Well, this is a controversial thing. Turns out I now have friends who do have pit bulls, and it turns out there are different kinds, and some are bred to be mean. But I'm going to presume that the assumption here is that Rover, as a pit bull, is said to be more dangerous than just a mere German Shepherd. Right? We've all been around German Shepherds. Some of them, if they've not been properly chained, can be a bit scary, but a pit bull is generally scary to most people. Again, I just note that that may not be the case now. I know I have several friends who have them. I don't and wouldn't own one. I'd have one myself without knowing a lot more about them, but they claim that they are not a problem. But in any event, we're going to presume that a pit bull is more dangerous. This helps Mia's case. Pit bulls are inherently more dangerous, at least they were. Now, I think they're being bred differently now, but let's just presume this is the case. The owner of a pit bull has a higher level of duty to ensure the safety of people nearby. This is all the more reason why Roger is liable. And indeed, when growing up in New York and so on, there were people who were tried for negligent homicide, for pit bulls who got loose and attacked neighbors and somebody on the street. That is, were they raising them in a way that made them even more dangerous, and therefore did they keep them safely from the public in the way that you might expect somebody who owns a handgun to be careful with that kind of weapon to keep it safely at home so that others aren't hurt. And in the same way you might expect people to operate their car. A DUI or DWI is a form of, you can be tried for homicide because of the way you operate that vehicle, right? Okay, so how does this fare? Bear on Mia's case, as we said, it strengthens it. Let's go through another fact. Foster is a man, but Mia is a woman. Well, let's leaving aside that there are still inequalities between men and women in our society. This should have no effect on the case. Okay, the sex of the plaintiff is probably irrelevant. Hopefully irrelevant. Hopefully the judge in the case is not biased against women or against men for that matter. So suppose, again, we're walking along. We have Mia getting bit by Roger. Rex was trained to attack on command, but Rover was not. How does fact bear on Mia's case? So strengthen it or weaken it? I don't think it has no effect. Rex was trained. Well, Foster won. So you could imagine that Foster said Rex was trained to attack on command. So Harris must have commanded him to attack Foster. Rover wasn't. So this seems more accidental. And so this weakens Mia's case. The fact that Rex was trained to attack implies that Harris had a hard duty to ensure the safety of people nearby. Right? This may be the reason why Foster won the case. In other words, it's not just the higher duty. It could be the fact that he suggested, told Rex to attack, whereas Rover was not trained to attack, and it's probably a reason why not a reason why Mia should win. Okay? So now you can turn to the exercises in your textbook, being sure to read the lengthy dialogue that relates to moral reasoning, and work through the exercises that relate to it. Okay? Again, I'm always available to meet with you. I hope that this is a clearer chapter if you were tired of symbolization, now that we've gotten out of it. I hope that you've found this helpful, actually, in thinking through, thinking, and the kind of inductive reasoning we use all the time. From whether you're going to go get Starbucks coffee or another form of coffee today, whether you're going to buy a certain type of printer, use a certain type of computer, buy a certain kind of lamp, whether you're going to find somebody to be a friend that you want to make based upon what others have said, and so on. These are all arguments from analogy, okay? And we use them all the time, okay? And so again, I'm always happy to do virtual or in office hours. You just need to email me, and we can get on that as soon as you do. Thank you very much. So I will exit. And I will bid adieu.